Hi, it's Lainy here again at Achievement for All, and today I'm joined by Bob Baseley, who's one of our coaches and is working on some very interesting projects, but he's here today to talk to us about a topic I think a lot of you will find interesting, which is cyberbullying. Hi Bob, welcome to the chat. I'm really interested to see what you're going to say. So what is cyberbullying and what sort of forms does it take?
Okay, I mean, cyberbullying, I think, links in with definitions of what people tend to call face-to-face bullying. So when it's in person, and that's defined in terms of it being a repeated act of unkind or aggressive behaviour that's quite deliberately designed to create hurt for someone. But also from the Anti-Bullying Alliance's point of view, also where there's a clear imbalance of power. So in other words, there's a situation where it might be a person who's older, who's the common perception is it's the person's bigger, than the other person, or but also, and I think particularly in the case of cyberbullying, where there appears to be, or there feels like there's many more people involved, and maybe where a person has greater technical knowledge than the other person, then that's where you can start to get that imbalance of power. In terms of different forms, I suppose early on in ages, it can crop up in gaming. So if there are groups of people gaming online with each other and talking to each other at the same time, then it can step into that area. I suppose very early on, as cyberbullying emerged as an issue, then people thought about texting and sending conventional messages. And we need to be thinking about that in terms of age groups, with certain age groups not having access to social media, that might be the areas where it starts. But then it can extend into activity on different social media platforms. And I talked about gaming, so the start point could be verbal. It could be either actually being said, or it could be typed or written in some way. It could be visual, so it can be photos being posted, unsolicited images being sent to people, and then it could also be, for want of a better word, psychological. So that could be the case where the image that's being sent is embarrassing. It's something that was taken without a person expecting it to be taken, and it's posted. It could be quite simply exclusion from a group, and we know that in social media platforms people can set up groups, they could leave a person out, and a similar experience to what people have on a face-to-face basis. And I would say I need to mention is the concept of humiliation, which might seem a bit strong, but it's that experience of having something put online that you don't want put online, having something shared. And I think it can go to the point as well with we talked about an imbalance of power. If someone has the technical expertise to set up false accounts, so it could be in the name of a person that they particularly want to make life difficult for, they might set up that account in their name and represent them to other social media platforms in a completely false way. So lots of different ways that it can happen. It can take.
It has, and you know what, that surprised me, because I thought I knew quite a lot about it, but it hadn't occurred to me they could set up an account for that person that they're trying to bully, to make them look ridiculous and humiliate them. So that's really interesting, and particularly as a parent as well, that's interesting. One of the things as well, I think, as you know, I work kind of with the older age group, and that humiliation thing, I think adults sometimes don't take that seriously enough, do they? They think it's a bit of a joke or a bit of a lark. And actually, I think a lot of teenagers find that a huge pressure, and it causes quite a lot of anxiety, doesn't it?
And I think that's a really important area to be thinking about as adults, is the context in which they're being active in that social media platform. And I'm going to use quite simplistic terms. I'm going to talk about the social rules of that platform. What is expected of a person who is actively participating in that platform? And I think, there are distinctivly different rules for engagement between, for example, Facebook and Instagram, and how you present yourself and in those ways. And I would argue that Instagram is quite a high stakes social media platform in which, you know, there seems to be that pressure to represent your best self all the time. And if there's any slip in that, or a mistake, or something happens there, then the sense of embarrassment, I think, could be more acute if you know, in that particular context. And having, therefore, in Instagram, someone pick out a fault, or someone identify an error or mistake, or post something that person doesn't want to be seen to other users, I think that's where that very, very strong emotion, that sense of shame can really come to the fore.
Yeah, and I think it's worth picking up at this point as well, things that I've kind of got involved in and seen and noticed and spoken to people about, is those little things that they pick up as mistakes. Adults assume, well, I make mistakes all the time. It's just a stupid slip up. It means nothing.
Yeah.
But it means a huge amount to children, young people and teenagers. And the other thing I think that people don't realise they do, particularly as you're getting, your child's getting a bit older, when you post things about your son or daughter, they can be humiliated for reasons you can't fathom. You have to be quite careful, don't you, as they're getting older, what you're posting about your young person, don't you? Have you found that out, Bob?
And I hope you don't mind. Can I take it to another area? So on that one hand, absolutely, that sense of embarrassment can have a big impact on the emotional well-being of the child. But the knock on that as well is, firstly, being fully aware of, if you are going to do that yourself, what your settings are like, who can access what it is that you're posting. And I was talking with Claire O'Keefe, who's my colleague working on the ICANN project, and she's described times where, you know, on that first day of school in September, the pictures of the child in the school uniform outside the front of the house with the number of the house and so on, really suddenly is telling a lot of people which school that child goes to, where they live, and so on. It's suddenly sharing an awful lot of information that you wouldn't be sharing online in any other way. So that has a big implication. The other aspect, and I think this is worth touching on, is I was going to sort of talk about this later, is having those conversations about online usage between each other, between adults, between children, because there's some very recent research that's saying, I think it's about 1 in 5 children won't tell adults about something that's happened online, usually for fear of having their technology confiscated. You know, something's gone wrong, it gets taken away from them. And I think there's a whole area there about their relationship with their technology, so there's quite a deep-seated fear there. But on top of that, what might get in the way is those different usages. You know, if one mum or dad is going to use social media to embarrass me, creates a bit of a barrier going on between that, which I think, as things become more refined, as a child gets older and learns to use social media more and more, really does need that conversation to be going on with families.
Totally agree. And I mean, I've got a teenager, you know, who's a gamer and whatever, and we've done a lot of conversations about it, and I'm even allowed a link to watch him, and I see what he does, and so we've built up that trust. But that's because I won't humiliate him. I ask his permission whether I can post things. And we always agree on everything. And even in some of the work that I do, obviously, you know, I talk to people about teenagers. I always ask his permission about, can I give them the example of you when I'm talking in a session? And we always agree with each other what's going out and what's not. And so I think that's really important advice, because that's worked really well for me, because I've got access to a lot of what he does because he now trusts me. So huge tip I would give anybody. And we were going to go into that bit next, weren't we, really, Bob? Because I know we were going to talk about the sort of school's responsibility and what it is they can do.
Well, I mean, if we were going to be strict about the responsibilities, there's a fair bit of legislation that makes it the school's responsibility to address this issue, ranging from 2006 Education Act that focuses on off-site behaviour and the degree to which schools should be involved in that, particularly, and I think a number of schools are picking this up, the fact that they have to get involved if it's going to affect relationships back in school. I'll be honest and say I've spoken to schools in all sorts of different capacities about this issue, and I have still come across schools where they say, oh well, as soon as it's outside the gates, that's nothing to do with us.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid there's various aspects of legislation that say no, actually it is. There's also the 2010, the responsibilities under the Equalities Act of 2010, and a whole range of other laws such as harassment laws, malicious communication laws, that mean the school needs to be involved. And if they want the best possible outcomes for the young people in their school, the children in their school, surely, you know, they've got to feel absolutely sure that when the children leave that school, they are fully aware of the legal implications of that sort of activity. And the schools I've come across with some of the things that they've done are, gosh, they range from agreeing a common definition for cyberbullying amongst everyone. So it's not the official line that they've borrowed from a particular body. It's something they've talked about with staff, with students, with pupils, and talked about it with families as well, so that everyone, if there is a cyberbullying incident, is very, very clear what it is. And I'm just going to pause on that point, because I think in terms of definition, one of the big issues is about whether it's repeated or not.
Right.
And therefore whether schools need to consider the difference between cyberbullying behaviour, as in a single incident, compared to a repeated act that could technically be called bullying, and that needs some consideration. I think as well, when we talked about the forms of which it could take, it's important, for example, to think about the context in which it happened, and those times when it's gone from group teasing about something into something a little bit more serious, or it's got to the point of creating, you know, toxic stress that someone's finding it very, very difficult to handle. So it's having that awareness of the social and emotional implications of online activity, I think, is an area that some schools are beginning to engage with, but I think is a very, very big area that needs addressing in some form. I think CPD for staff. And one thing that's fascinating me is talking with some schools as saying we're having to learn the language that the children use between each other, face to face, but also that ramps up even higher online, you know, and how to pick that up. And maybe focusing explicitly on social media etiquette, what is expected in those different platforms and how you expect it to behave, and because it can become quite attritional if someone doesn't behave in the way that is expected amongst that group or amongst a broader range of users. And it's on the safeguarding aspect, it's just making sure that someone who steps into that area knows full well what it is that's expected within that social area, and it's made explicit to them.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of pressure, isn't there? Quite a lot of peer pressure in those arenas. Yeah.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, well, maybe that's the wrong word, but it can be a trial and error way of learning, which may create even further anxiety for someone. And I think the other thing that schools can do, and I'm seeing it particularly in primaries, is just setting up digital leaders. I cannot remember right now which body it is that's set up that, but there's also another group called e-cadets that's being set up as well. And just this whole idea of building peer support for online usage. So in addition to building up CPD for staff and their knowledge, there's actually peer-to-peer support. And it's an area that's growing, but I think they're currently operating in areas where they feel quite safe of giving advice about online safety, but I think that could develop even more to almost like a peer support, mentoring, counselling role that could be taken on for people who are finding that a difficult area in which to be.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, because obviously young people listen to young people and they think we don't know anything, don't they? So I think that's probably a really valuable resource to have.
Yeah, I mean, the Digital Leader Scheme actively encourages digital leaders to go into the classroom and lead lessons, lead learning and lead assemblies about those issues. So suddenly within a school, they've got a body of students or a body of pupils who know these things, and maybe people can approach them for...
Fantastic. That sounds really good.
Yeah.
And of course, the other thing that we've got to think about is the school needs to build some kind of partnership with the parents as well, don't they? To sort of prevent it in the first place, but also in the current situation where everybody's locked in home, it could be happening more in the home as well, where parents may or may not be aware of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of schools have worked with parents in terms of making sure they know age limits for accessing particular apps, particular social media platforms. And the lot of the advice that's gone out at primary level is about supervision and settings, and that therefore, and that's had an interesting impact for parents. When I've talked to parents about this, some have said they actually went from actually denying any access on the internet to their 9-year-old to actually allowing that to happen, because having learnt from the school about the settings that they could put in place, they actually could start to build that trust and feel more confident about their child's online activity. There's also the area of supervision about whether online activity takes place in a public place, so a social place, a place where parents can walk by and they can see what's going on, or they can hear what's going on. So some parents will talk about how any gaming takes place on the family TV, and they can hear the conversations that are going on between the players. And I think the one interesting thing is I've been to a couple of schools where they actually have an operating system that they share with home. So there are some operating systems out there where the parents can use it at home, and it's actually a form by which, it's shared by school and home, and both home and school can monitor the child's online activity as a result.
Oh wow! Okay, yes,
so,
I didn't know that.
So there's things there, but we've already talked about this, and I think it's an area that schools are beginning to move into. Was this whole concept about talking and sharing and listening, talking about online activity, and understanding contexts, because I think one of the big areas here is an example of cyberbullying behaviour could be an unkind comment that a child takes to a parent and shows them and says, this is going on. But I think increasingly we need to be aware of the thread. We need to be thinking about what else was said and how might it have built up to that particular moment. And I think it's important to encourage parents to have that knowledge of the different friendship groups, and to discuss how they interact online with them, so they've got that background knowledge to whatever emerges.
Yeah, I think probably a sort of tip as well to leave people with is from my experience both in teaching and as a parent, is get involved in technology as soon as possible with your child, because if you grow with them, then you can also teach them and guide them. And I know they're going to go off and do some things on their own, but as long as you're on a lot of that journey with them, I think I found that that's kind of one of the benefits. If you've got a younger child at the moment, you're probably get in there quick, because you want to build that trust. And the other thing is you want them to trust you, because a lot of what they see online is untrustworthy, and you don't want them to get their information always from there, do you?
No, and I think that's a whole other area about working with them to think about the source where that information came from, how it's presented, and so on, and have those conversations. But I think what you've just suggested also means that fun can be had. It can be, therefore everyone feels safer and more secure, and can actually have fun and find it an inspirational, creative place to be.
And that's exactly it. It can actually be fun. It doesn't have to be, the kind of all the downsides that we've talked about, does it? It can actually be something positive. So if people want some advice and guidance or additional help, either in a school or for parents, where's sort of places they can go to get that, Bob?
Gosh, so there's CEOP with their Think You Know programme. There's a body called Internet Matters. I'm trying to think of others. There's a whole range of different support groups out there. The Anti-Bullying Alliance also provides a lot of information there, and actually has a dedicated module that they've put up for parents about interacting, supporting children with online activity. So there's those just three that I can think of at the top of my head, but I don't doubt that if you put into a search engine, support with cyberbullying or advice on cyberbullying, there'll be an awful lot of different agencies that can step forward and provide that help. But those are just three that's worth having a look at first of all.
Okay. Oh, that's been really interesting, Bob. I mean, even I found that really interesting today, because obviously I can see a personal connection to it as well. And that was great. So if you would like any more information, then do please get in contact. When this video finishes, you're going to see a link to click on there, and we're asking you to maybe pop £1 in the pot towards our charity, because we are committed to helping young vulnerable people achieve and looking at their well-being as well. I'd like to thank Bob for joining me today. Thank you very much. Hopefully we can have you back again, and we will see you for our next week's video in due course. Thanks a lot for listening. Bye.